Japan, this is back on the Middle East, but Nagasaki, of course, today's the 8th. It's the anniversary tomorrow of the atomic bombing in Nagasaki. Ambassador Emmanuel, as well as the British ambassador, and I think the European ambassadors are not going to attend because the Israeli ambassador wasn't invited. The Nagasaki mayor says this is logistical. Why is it so important that the Israeli ambassador be present?
Look, we thought it was important that the Israeli ambassador be invited. Good afternoon, everyone. Man, this is a sparse crowd today. End of the week, August. Everyone's getting tired. Let me start with some brief opening remarks. This weekend, on August 10th, marks 2 years since Mahmoud Habibi and Ryan Corbett were taken captive in separate incidents in Afghanistan. That's 2 years that they have been separated from their families. We are deeply concerned about the well-being of Americans unjustly detained in Afghanistan, Mahmoud, Ryan, and George Glesman, and raise their detentions in every engagement we have with the Taliban. Bringing them home will continue to be a top priority for the United States as we work to obtain their release. The Biden-Harris administration is committing to bringing home every unjustly detained American overseas, and we have a track record of doing so, as you all saw just last week. Over the past 3.5 years, we have brought home over 50 Americans who have been unjustly detained, and our efforts will continue until all of those who have been detained are reunited with their families. With that, Sean?
Sure, unless anybody wants to follow up on that.
I do,
Go ahead.
actually, if you don't mind.
No, please,
Just
please.
directly on your topper. So first, every engagement you've had with the Taliban, can you say how many engagements there have been with the Taliban?
No, I'd have to take that back and we have, as you know, from time to time, engaged with them at international fora, and in every one of those engagements we raise, among other issues, the need for them to release the Americans that they are unjustly detaining.
Okay, the frequency of those interactions, I think, would be of interest to these
Yeah,
families.
I'm happy to take it back and get it to you.
And on Ryan Corbett in particular, I mean, Ryan's wife, Anna, has spoken publicly in recent days about how difficult it has been for families to learn of possibly disparate levels of attention. Painstaking diplomacy, I think, were her words, to detainees whose profiles may not have reached the level of attention that, for example, the detainees who were being held in Russia had. So is it fair to say that these cases in Afghanistan have gotten less attention, fewer resources by comparison?
Absolutely not. So let me say two things about that. Number one, we don't determine the level of attention that cases get from the press. I think you know that the media covers some cases more prominently than others, but we control the level of attention that we commit on behalf of the United States government. And I can tell you that we are absolutely committed to bringing home Ryan Corbett and the other detainees wrongfully detained in Afghanistan, as well as detainees wrongfully held all around the world. And the Secretary has spoken to Ryan Corbett's wife. I know she was here just this week and met with Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, met with Roger Karstens, the SPIHA. We engage with the family all the time and continue to work through our diplomatic efforts to try and bring them home. That said, I've said this before, it's impossible for me to imagine what these family members must be going through. And I assume that it's particularly painful every time they see other detainees brought home because they can't help but think about their loved ones who we weren't able to get out at that time. So I would just point to the track record that we have had over the past 3.5 years. And when we say we're not forgetting anyone, we mean it. And we have the record to back that up. And we will continue to use every resource the United States government has to try and bring Ryan and other wrongfully detained Americans home.
I recognize it's a different spokesperson in a different building, but Anna in particular has been pained by the fact that she hasn't been able to secure a second meeting with Jake Sullivan, despite a promise he apparently made to meet with her before the State of the Union if Ryan wasn't free by then, nor has she been able to meet with President Biden. I don't know if you're in a position to say whether state steps in those instances or...
So I certainly can't speak for the schedules of principals not in the State Department, but I know that Jake Sullivan has met with her before. And as I said, we just held a number of meetings with her this week, and we'll continue to meet with her. We'll continue to engage with her. The Secretary has talked with her. I know that our colleagues in the White House will continue to engage with her as well. As when it comes to specific schedules, of course, I can't speak to that from here.
Thank you, sorry.
Just can I follow up on that again? So
Yeah.
Sure.
Just stay on that subject. Just to understand, you're using the term unjustly detained. I think when you're referring to the three, but is there wrongfully detained determinations on?
There are wrongful. We have made determinations that Ryan Corbett and George Glessman are wrongfully detained. That's not a determination we have yet made with respect to Mahmoud Habibi, which is not to say we're not working to try and secure his release. We are working to try and secure his release. Oftentimes, we can't make a wrongful determination, a wrongful detention determination because we don't have access to certain types of information or because the situation is unclear. There can be other factors as well, but I can tell you we are working overtime to try to get his release as well.
What's the difference when you say someone is unjustly detained and say they're wrongfully
So
detained?
they're wrongfully detained is a legal determination under the factors of the Levinson Act. There are other people who we believe are unjustly detained. Mahmoud Habibi is one of them, but for whatever reason, we have not been able to apply the factors of the Levinson Act, either because they don't meet that criteria in that case, or we don't have sufficient information to make that determination, but we still have information to believe that it's an American citizen that ought to be released, and we try to get them released, and that's what we're doing with Mahmoud Habibi.
Sure, let's go to the Middle East.
Sure.
Lots to discuss, but could I actually start with Norway, Israel and Norway? The Israelis have revoked the diplomatic status of a number of Norwegian diplomats accredited for the Palestinian Authority. This obviously after Norway, along with Ireland and Spain, recognized a state of Palestine. The U.S. has good relations with Israel and Norway. Do you have any comment on this?
We have good relations with both of them, as you point out. I think I would just say that Norway has a long history of playing a productive role when it comes to engaging with the government of Israel and engaging with the Palestinian Authority, engaging with the Palestinian people. If you look at their role in helping mediate the Oslo Accords, if you look at their role just this year in helping facilitate the release of tax revenue to the Palestinian Authority, they have long played an important role, and we think it's important that they continue to be able to play that role in talking both with the PA and with Israel. We don't think steps to prevent them from playing that role are particularly helpful, and we'll continue to engage with both countries.
Has the United States engaged specifically with Israel in this? So that,
I'm not aware of any specific conversations. We may have had them in the embassy. I'm just not aware of any.
to put it a bit more directly, would the United States hope that Israel takes back this step?
So I'm not going to speak to that. We always believe that diplomatic engagements are important, diplomatic relationships are important, and we have seen that diplomatic relationships between Norway and Israel have been important, and that it's been important that Norway be able to communicate with Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and we think that the productive role they can continue to play, and we would hope that they would be able to do so.
Sure.
Follow up on that real quickly.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah.
Are you worried that that's going to that this is going to lead to a dissolution of this agreement that you have about
I don't have
Palestinian tax
I
payments?
don't have any specific concern about that at this point. Obviously, it's something that we'll monitor over the days to come. We have seen tax revenue continue to be transferred. I believe some was just transferred either today or in the last few days, and it's important that that revenue continue to be transferred. It is, as we've said a number of times, ultimately money to which the PA is entitled. So it's something we'll continue to monitor. Go ahead. Well, I was going to go through the front, but I've already come to you, so I should go
I
to
know,
Saeed.
I'm
But
sorry. Well,
go
it's
ahead.
Middle East specific.
Go
I'm
ahead.
happy to wait
Go
if
ahead.
others.
No, go ahead.
So you can come to me.
Go ahead.
One, does the U.S. have any indications from its diplomatic conversations that Iran is rethinking any part of the need to retaliate for the strike on Haniyeh?
So two things to that. One, I'm not going to speak to our private diplomatic conversations. I'm certainly not going to speak to what Iran may or may not be planning. Other than to say, as we've said for several days now, and it's been the focus of our diplomatic engagements, is we continue to make clear to Iran that they should not escalate this conflict, they should not take any further escalatory steps if those steps are not in their interests, they're not in the interests of the wider region, and that is a point we will continue to impress in all of our diplomatic engagements in the region.
You've also stressed the need or the help that a ceasefire deal would provide in lowering tensions. Is it clear to the U.S. how persuasive the prospect of a ceasefire deal is to the Iranians? Is the appeal of a deal greater than the need to retaliate?
So, again, I don't want to speak for the Iranians or try to make an assessment about what is convincing to the Iranians or what is compelling to them or what's going to go into their mind when they make their decisions. I will say that there are two sides of this coin. On one side of the coin, yes, we believe that a ceasefire would go a long way towards alleviating tensions in the region. It would obviously have immediate benefits for the Palestinian people in Gaza. It would have immediate benefits for the hostages and their families. But we think it would allow us to make progress in the diplomatic endeavors we have been pursuing to bring calm along the Israel-Lebanon border. And it would allow us to ease broader regional tensions. On the other side of that coin, certainly any further escalation just makes all of the region's problems more difficult. And one of the problems that we're addressing is the conflict in Gaza and trying to reach a ceasefire. So it is true that anytime you have an increase in tensions, it makes all of our diplomatic efforts more difficult. So I would hope that that's something that Iran is paying attention to and something that they're cognizant of, and they wouldn't want to do anything to hurt prospects for a ceasefire. They wouldn't want to do anything to further raise regional tensions and raise the risk of this conflict spiraling out of control, but we can't speak for them.
You spoke yesterday about the need for an in-person negotiator to be designated by Hamas before ceasefire talks could be taken over the finish line. Until that person is designated or steps forward or is named, is the U.S. trying to sort of get Israel's side of the deal to a final place so that once there is a designation, all it takes is a signature?
So it's hard to say getting one side to the deal to a final place when it obviously is a negotiation and you can't get agreement from one party without the other. Let me say two things about it, though. Yes, we have been in contact with Israel about trying to get a deal finalized, and we have been in contact with the other two mediators, Egypt and Qatar, about how we would get, potential ways to get a deal finalized and how we might bridge the differences between the two parties. And the second thing I'll say is we continue to emphasize to the government of Israel, as we believe Egypt and Qatar are emphasizing to Hamas, that the onus is on them to agree to a ceasefire, that we have made great headway, but we need to finalize the agreement. We need to finalize it as soon as possible.
I have one more on Vienna, but we'll defer.
Oh, wait, Saeed, go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, in response to Olivia on the deal, the Israeli press, Yediot Aharonot and the Times of Israel both reported that the United States is willing to let Israel start whatever military operations after phase 1 of a ceasefire. Can you confirm that?
No, I can't. I don't know to what that's referring. Obviously, we've spoken to the framework of a deal a number of times, and the framework of the deal is that there is a 6-week ceasefire that would be agreed to once the deal is finalized. And before that 6-week ceasefire ends, we would enter into further negotiations to try to extend it and try to get into phase 2 of the agreement. And so what we have made clear we want to see happen is for that ceasefire to be extended and ultimately provide an end to the war, and beyond that, provide broader peace and stability. But of course, there is a negotiation process at the end of stage 1 that has always been clear. We've been, I think, quite open about that.
Now, these reports claim that Prime Minister Netanyahu insists on having something in writing from you. He said that he can attack at will, basically. That this is a condition that he will not budge from. Do you have any comment on that?
Again, I don't know what those reports are referring to, but Saeed, if you look at the very well described, architecture of the agreement, there is a negotiation process at the end of phase 1 that you have to go through and you have to reach to get to phase 2. I think that's been quite clear, and it will require, as has been true for getting to just getting to where we have before. Of course, that'll be a negotiation, and Israel will want to make sure that its interests are protected in that negotiation. But we have been very clear that we want to see this ultimately lead to an end to the war.
By all accounts, the negotiations right now are not moving or frozen or whatever, on hold. But Hamas said that, or Sinwar said that they want to go ahead with the ceasefire talks. Does that change in any way the pace of what's going on?
So I am not going to get into an underlying discussion about the negotiations themselves, other than to say that certainly we want to see them finalized.
And finally, I wanted to ask you about the, the administration is being sued by Israeli settlers whom you have imposed sanctions on. I mean, how do you handle a situation like this? And especially, I mean, this morning, Mr. Netanyahu told the settlers that he is going to do everything possible to reverse those sanctions. In fact, he promised them that he will do that.
So on our underlying policy, we've been quite clear about that policy and the reason for it. But when it comes to the litigation itself, I have to, of course, defer to the Department of Justice to speak to it.
That is not going to, let's say, to sway the decision one way or the other. The fact that there may be some legal ramifications
So I'm not.
for
So
this.
to be clear, I'm not in any way going to comment on litigation because, as
Okay,
I've said before, when I was at the Justice Department, I didn't like it when people at the State Department podium commented on it. So I'm going to try to respect that equity. That said, we have been quite clear that we expect Israel to take actions to crack down on settler violence, and if they don't, we will. We have taken those steps, and we will continue to do so as appropriate.
Just to clarify, I'm asking policy question, not that.
Yeah. Well, that's why. Hold on. That's why. That's why I
you-
answered on the policy grounds without speaking to the legal case.
Thank you.
Could I just follow up
Yeah.
briefly, just one more on the IOC? So the OIC.
I was going to say what. I was going to say. I didn't know. I wasn't aware we'd gotten a question about that yet.
Exactly. Although there was some issue with China and the U.S. on the Olympics. But I was just going to ask the statement from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation on the killing of Hania. Does the United States have a take on that? They're basically criticizing the killing, saying that it wasn't wasn't supportive of the region. Do you have any read about what came out of the meeting, whether it was at all helpful for the U.S. goals in de-escalating?
So I don't want to speak to the meeting in specific, other than to say, look, as we have made clear, we were not involved in his death. We were not aware of his death before it happened. And our focus now is going to continue to be to try to convince all parties in the region from taking further steps to escalate the conflict. And it's certainly our hope that at that meeting yesterday, our partners in the region did make clear to Iran what we know they believe and what they've told us they believe, which is further escalation only damages the region and raises the risk of the conflict spiraling out of control. Yeah.
Come back to the actually just to follow up on Saeed's question. So if the State Department is sued, you won't comment.
When the State Department is sued, the same way any agency of the federal government is sued, they are represented in court by the Justice Department, and we defer to the Justice Department to speak to matters of litigation. I will still speak to the policy questions, which I did, but when it comes to litigation itself, I have to defer to the Justice Department.
It's a lawsuit against this department, but yeah. That
And,
makes sense.
I'm going to let our attorneys speak for us,
Sure.
which is always good advice.
And just to follow up on the hostage talks, ceasefire talks, there's some reporting from the National in the region that Yahya Sinwar, after being appointed as the new head of Hamas, has sent a message through the Egyptian mediators of his kind of position on the talks, saying he's got his firm position is that there should be a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. He wants the release of high-profile detainees. He's against the deployment of a multinational force. So these are things that I think the U.S. Some of those things the U.S. has been in support of. It seems to suggest that he's going to have a stronger, or potentially there could be an even more difficult approach by Hamas to the negotiations. Have you been sort of informed by the Egyptians of a message coming from Sinwar to the negotiating team there about any new position or new approach?
Look, I'm not going to negotiate in public at all. But I will say one thing that was true before the death of Hania and remains true today is that Sinwar was ultimately the decider when it comes to questions on these talks. And so whether he is sending messages directly or sending messages through intermediaries, he has always been the person who would decide whether Hamas agreed to a ceasefire or not, and under what conditions they would agree to a ceasefire. So we don't believe that has changed.
Back to the Middle East,
Yeah.
Matt. Wall Street Journal is just reporting that the U.S. has warned Iran that its government and economy would suffer a devastating blow in case it retaliates against Israel. I was wondering if this is necessary, if it's necessary to go that far to hurt the economy, which typically and naturally affects the people, to deter Iran?
So I am not going to speak to messages, real or imagined, that might have been delivered to the Iranian government. We have always said that we have the ability to deliver messages when it's in our interest, but we typically don't speak to those messages in public, and oftentimes you see messages described that are not described entirely accurately. That said, of course, escalation of the conflict has the ability to hurt Iran's economy. It has the ability to hurt the economy of every country in the region. War obviously has the potential impact of hurting economies. And so something I said yesterday is that every problem that the region currently faces is made worse by further escalation, and that certainly includes economic impacts. Saeed.
Austin Tice.
Yeah.
I mean, we're coming up on the 12th anniversary of his disappearance, and I remember asking the very same question probably, why didn't he disappear back then? So why are you not willing to speak with the Syrian government on this? I mean, it's a country that you still recognize, and they claim they don't know anything about him, but
So
I assume that if you probably work with them, they probably could find out what happened.
Saeed, I will say that we are taking every step that we believe is productive to try and secure his return. We don't speak to all those steps publicly, don't speak to most of those steps publicly, but everything that we believe can be productive in securing the release of any wrongfully detained American, we try to take. Yeah.
A couple in Asia. Could we go to Bangladesh? Mohammed Yunus was sworn in today as the interim leader of Bangladesh. Can you say, first of all, if there's been any communication with him directly or indirectly?
There has been communication with the interim government, and our chargé d'affaires attended his swearing in today. I don't know if she spoke to him at the swearing in, but she did attend.
Okay, communication with the interim government, not necessarily him personally, but with
Correct.
And what was the
I mean, he was only sworn into the government, I think,
A
an
few
hour
hours
ago,
ago,
so
right.
an hour or two ago.
What was the nature of the communication? I'm not asking for specifics, but was it in terms of the path forward in Bangladesh? Was it about U.S. interests?
So I'm not going to speak to the private diplomatic conversations, but obviously one of the things that we have made clear is that we want to see the interim government chart a democratic future for the people of Bangladesh.
Unless somebody wants to follow up on that, should I? A couple other.
Yeah, go ahead.
Japan. This is back on the Middle East, but Nagasaki. Of course, today's the 8th. It's the anniversary tomorrow of the atomic bombing in Nagasaki. Ambassador Emmanuel, as well as the British ambassador, and I think the European ambassadors are not going to attend because the Israeli ambassador wasn't invited. The Nagasaki mayor says this is logistical. Why is it so important that the Israeli ambassador be present?
Look, we thought it was important that the Israeli ambassador be invited, as the ambassadors of other countries have been invited, that no country that should have been singled out to not be invited to this celebration, and that's why the ambassador took the step that he did, and I presume why the ambassadors of other countries took the steps that they did in deciding not to attend.
But in terms of, to play devil's advocate, in terms of historic responsibility, obviously the U.S. dropped the bomb in Nagasaki. Was it particularly significant for the U.S. to be there? I realize he was there at the Hiroshima.
Look, he was there, and obviously multiple different presidents of the United States have spoken to this, have attended events commemorating that solemn event, and I think our position on it and our respect for Japan when it comes to this anniversary is well documented and goes far beyond the ambassador not attending one event.